We're starting a new unit right now, Unit 3, and our key concept for the next few days is that British attempts to assert tighter control over its North American colonies and the colonial resolve to pursue self-government led to a colonial independence movement in the Revolutionary War. So that's setting up what we're going to talk about throughout this entire unit. So the argument today is that there was competition among the British, French, and American Indians for economic and political advantage in North America, and this culminated in the 7 Years' War, or otherwise known as the French and Indian War, in which the British defeat France and the allied American Indians that worked with France. So first we're going to talk about this colonial rivalry. It intensified between Britain and France in the mid-18th century because there was a growing population of British colonies in the interior of North America, and that threatened the French and Indian trade networks near the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley in the American Indian autonomy. So my first example is the Native-Euro alliances in the French and Indian War. There are two major alliances, the French and the Hurons, and the British and the Iroquois. As English and French colonists begin to expand west to the Ohio River Valley, conflict erupts between the British and the French. Many Native Americans were displaced due to this expansion, and their economies and demographics changed, as we discussed in the previous unit. French traders and the Huron Indians developed an alliance as early as the 1600s. Early in the French and Indian War, the French and Huron troops hid in the woods to attack George Washington. He was in his early 20s, and other British and colonial troops. There was a bloody battle, and the French and Indians won. Many battles, at least, in the beginning of the French and Indian War. A battle in 1754 marked the beginning of the French and Indian War. The British allied with the Iroquois for trade, and this relationship continued as they fought through the war. So the Iroquois actually fought on the British side in the French and Indian War. The Albany Plan of Union was a plan that was created to unify a government between the 13 colonies, and it was proposed by Benjamin Franklin. It was actually signed by the Colonial Congress at the Albany Conference in New York in July of 1754, and the intention was to address shared colonial interests and protect the colonies. Ultimately, this was rejected by King George II and the colonial governments that had considered its adoption. And the significance of this is that it was the first attempt to develop an intercolonial cooperation amongst the British colonies. The Treaty of Paris was something that marked the end of the French and Indian War. It was signed in 1763. The British won a victory in this war. The Treaty of Paris was very harsh to France. It took away all of France's North American territory, which was the mainland. Britain receives Quebec and the Ohio River Valley. Spain gets the port of New Orleans and the land west of the Mississippi for their efforts to help the British. They were also allies. The Iroquois are given nothing for their work as a British ally. British soldiers needed to help the colonists fight the threat of the French, so the British soldiers remained in the colonies, especially in New England after the war. The British soldiers looked down on the colonists. They viewed them as crude and uncultured. This pushed the colonists in Britain further apart. American colonies actually felt closer to each other. All 13 colonies had put men and their lives on the line together to protect the land that they called home. And the results of the Treaty of Paris and the French and Indian War for the colonists was nationalism, pride, joy, and a flourishing economy, especially between their ports, their trade, and their agriculture. The next thing we're going to talk about is how Britain achieved a major territorial expansion of its territorial holdings by defeating the French, but this was at a tremendous expense. It set the stage for imperial efforts to raise revenue and consolidate control over the colonies, which we know ended up backfiring. So the first example is the writs of assistance. This was implemented in 1760 by a governor in Massachusetts. The writs of assistance were documents that served as general search warrants. They allowed customs officials to search any ship or building that they suspected might hold smuggled goods in the colonies. The goal was to stop smuggling so the British could collect duties or taxes on imported goods. The writs of assistance infuriated politically active merchants, especially smugglers like John Hancock. The Vice-Admiralty courts were essentially places to try smugglers. These were juryless courts in British colonies. They had jurisdiction in maritime issues, aka trade smuggling in the colonies. They also dealt with disputes between merchants and seamen. There were 11 total in the colonies, each handled its own region. Judges heard all of the evidence in these trials, and they made a decision since there was no jury. The colonists, especially those accused of smuggling, argued that there was a lack of jury, and that interfered with their constitutional rights. They were referring to the English Bill of Rights, which guaranteed a constitution for citizens. However, the judges were chosen from amidst the colonies. In 1764, it gets worse. Super Vice-Admiralty courts were created in Nova Scotia. They had jurisdiction from Newfoundland to Florida. The judge was sent straight from England and delivered heavily biased rulings. Many smugglers were required to appear and pay for their own transport in these super Vice-Admiralty courts. And if officials thought local courts would rule in favor of the colonists, any trial was sent to these super Vice-Admiralty courts. If the colonists did not show up to court, they were found guilty automatically. Also, the English believed that you were guilty until you were proven innocent. So that takes a spin on things that we have today in our government. Now we have virtual representation of Parliament. This is a concept that stated that the members of Parliament reserved the right to speak for all British subjects, not just their own district that elected them. This was meant to diminish colonial angst, since they could not elect members of Parliament because they were not landowners in England. This was not super effective in stopping colonial unrest. The last proof that we're going to discuss is that after the British victory, imperial officials' attempts to prevent colonists from moving westward generated colonial opposition, while native groups sought to both continue trading with Europeans and resist the encroachments of colonists on tribal lands. So the first thing we'll talk about is Pontiac's War. In 1763, Pontiac, the leader of the Ottawa tribe, leads a rebellion against the British, who had encroached on the Great Lakes area, Fort Detroit. The British defended their fort successfully, but Native American resistance spread, and Pontiac soon tripled his force. Tribes launched attacks against British settlements and military outposts. They captured 8 of 12 outposts in Ohio River Valley. In 1766, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs and Chief Pontiac negotiate terms for peace. The British government writes the Proclamation of 1763, and this draws a boundary west of the Appalachian, and it declares that British settlers cannot pass the line. This is to protect Native American tribal land. While the British hoped to end Indian resistance, they actually provoked the wrath of the colonists, and this is one of the grievances that leads to the Revolutionary War. And finally, we have Chief Little Turtle and the Western Confederacy. Post-Revolutionary War in 1790, so we're going ahead in time a little bit. There were Western Native tribes in the Ohio River Valley that had a strong alliance with British Canada. They wanted to defend themselves from the aggressive American settlement once America had won independence. Chief Little Turtle and the Miami tribe and others led many raids against the American settlements in this Ohio River Valley. They had major victories in defeating the American military in 1790 and 1791. However, in response to these attacks, the U.S. federal government chose to militarize rather than negotiate like the British used to do. The U.S. Army in the West expanded dramatically, and that led to a U.S. victory in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, and it ends the resistance of Chief Little Turtle and the Western Confederacy. If you guys have any questions, please let me know.